Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hannah Arendt Center's virtual reading group. Roger, you look like you were ready to start this conversation.
Yeah, I thought I was.
I was up this week, you're next week, but we can switch it if you want.
Well, why don't I start because I prepared it. Is that all right? And then you can add in, or
Yeah,
is that
I
okay?
prepared it as well, so they can get a
Okay.
double feature.
All right, great. Um, Great. Well, you guys will get a double treat. So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are coming very much to the end of Hannah Arendt's book, The Life of the Mind. Uh, this is well, I should say, till volume one of Hannah Arendt's book, The Life of the Mind, which is titled Thinking. Um, it's not a finished book, as we've talked about, and it's a book that needs to be, I think, read carefully. Section one on thinking is probably the most finished of the three sections. Willing, which is finished at least in a draft form, is as Samantha and I were talking about this week, is not widely read very often, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is it's her most philosophical text probably that she ever wrote, and it can be a bit plodding for some. And then there's the question of exactly what she's doing with it. We'll talk at the end of this session about whether we want to read Willing. But let's see if we can make some sense of the life of the mind. And I thought to do that, and Samantha and I both prepared this and probably have different approaches, but I thought I'd go back and give us a little bit of a review through the book and see how we got where we are, and then move forward. So just to remind ourselves that the life of the mind begins with an introduction, and in that introduction, she sort of sets two reasons for beginning this book. One is the Eichmann trial and her question that comes to us of whether the activity of thinking might be among the conditions that make man abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against evil doing. And that is, in many ways, the reason she begins to write this book on thinking. She also says that she wanted to, in a sense, update her first major philosophical book or political theoretical book, The Life of the Human Condition, or as her title would have it, the Vita Activa, which looked at the life of action. And she says one of the things that's left out of it, intentionally so, is the thinking activity. And this makes sense because thinking, she says, is not really an action that accomplishes anything. And so she said, what I never really asked in that book, although it's sort of, she says, you can find it in the book that I didn't ask it, is what are we doing when we do nothing but think? That's on page 8. And so this book is an attempt to, in a sense, answer these two questions. What are we doing when we do nothing but think? And then can this thinking activity actually condition us and make us abstain from doing evil? The other two important points in the introduction, and this is very important for us thinking through this book, is that the fundamental assumption underlying the whole book, and she comes to this again on the very last page of what we read for today, on thinking, or the penultimate, maybe not the last page, but where she says that the assumption that she is going off from, that her whole inquiry into thinking, she says, is based on a single assumption, and that is the assumption that the thread of tradition is broken. This is a theme in her work throughout even the late 1940s. It's already in The Origins of Totalitarianism. It comes to the fore in a series of essays in the book Between Past and Future. that she writes in the 1950s. And the basic idea here is the same one that you hear in poetry and in many thought. Yeats' poem, "Things Fall Apart, the Center Cannot Hold." For Arendt, what she adds to this are a couple of things. The idea that the Roman trinity of religion, authority, and tradition, and the continuity of the past, the idea that we live in a past that continues into the present, has basically fallen apart, has fallen away. We no longer can count on that tradition to give us the banisters, to use a word we've talked about a lot in this reading group, the banisters that hold us in line and keep us moving in a particular direction. And so the banisters of tradition, the banisters of thought have fallen away. And so she says in the introduction, that's again where she's coming from. The death of metaphysics, the death of God, the death of political authority, the death of tradition, the break of tradition. And yet she says we are still thinking beings. And this is really, again, if you want, the third beginning of the book. So the first one is Eichmann and that thinking condition us against evil. The second one is what are we doing when we think? The third beginning of the book is, but we are still thinking beings even though the Western tradition has been broken. And actually that comes from the last part of the essay on the modern tradition in Between Past and Future, where she says that Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche were all people who broke the tradition, and what they broke with was the tradition of man as a rational animal. And so now what we're seeing is, even though we break with this tradition and we break with the tradition of man as a rational animal, we are all still thinking beings. And this brings us to the fourth beginning of the book, and the one that I argue is most important, namely, and I must have talked about it 15 times in the first 2 or 3 sessions that we met, on page 15, where she says the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And so this question of thinking as what can condition us against evil, what is the thinking activity? We are still thinking beings even though the tradition is broken, and that thinking is not about truth, not about science, but about meaning. These are the guiding threads of the book. I've sort of prepared to go all through it and give you a quick summary, and maybe I'll do it quickly. In the first section on appearance, the whole premise is that the world is a phenomenal and is appearance, and that to be alive is to appear in the world. And yet there's one great exception to this, which is thinking. Thinking withdraws, and inner self never appears, on page 39. And yet somehow, even though thinking is the exception that doesn't appear in the world, we believe in the thinking ego. And she says that this comes from Kant primarily, who thinks the thinking ego is the thing in itself, is sheer activity, and that this sheer activity thinking is worldless, is invisible, is withdrawn from the real world, and yet it becomes a semblance, a deception, a fallacy that we nevertheless find meaningful. We are thinking beings. And so she asks this question on page 45, is the semblance of the thinking ego something like a dogmatic metaphysical fallacy, as some Oxford philosophers would say? Or is it an inherent and paradoxical condition of living being that, though part of the world of appearances, possesses an ability to think that permits the mind to withdraw from the world without leaving it entirely? And so this is the main move in this first chapter on appearance, that while appearance is actually what the world is about, insofar as we're thinking beings, we're this paradoxical being that can withdraw from the world and leave without leaving the world entirely. And insofar as that we can do that, we think we can actually destroy reality in our thoughts. And our thoughts, she says, are not about truth again, but about meaning. In the second chapter on mental activities in a world of appearances, we get to this point again where the mind is separate from all things, the mind is invisible, we withdraw, it is an authentic semblance. But now we add in a new idea that the withdrawal of the thinker or the scholar out of the world into the life of the mind, where he's a spectator and not a doer. He spectates the world. The world is full of spectacles for him. And the spectator, not the doer, thinks, and thus holds the clue to the meaning of human affairs. And so here's where she starts to say there's actually an importance to thinking as a non-worldly, non-apparent activity. And the reason this happens is that in the language, in thinking and withdrawing and spectating, we are caught up in language. And language, she says, is not again about truth or falsity. It's not about communication. It's about the production of meaning. And the examples she gives are prayer and poetry. So that language as a pictorial, metaphorical, and optical idea means that thinking, while it withdraws, never actually leaves the world of appearances, and yet it always is out of order in the world of appearances. It's not about truth. It's not about reality. It produces no end result. It is, she says, simply about the quest for meaning. Keeps coming back. And we're going to get there as to what that means. And so she says, we need to ask why we think, but we can't really ask directly why we think, so we ask what makes us think. And that's chapter 3. And she gives a number of different answers through history as to what makes us think. The Greeks think to achieve immortality. The Christians think, since we already have our immortality in our soul, we don't need to seek immortality. Plato, she says, thinks with the beginning of wonder and assumes a unity and admiration for the world. The Romans admire nothing and thus think from unhappiness and division and a turn away from reality. And this begins the modern idea of the thinker as the person who turns away from worldly reality and creates thought castles in their head. And then she comes to Socrates as the model thinker and says that for Socrates, talking and thinking about piety and justice and courage were likely to make man more pious, just, and courageous. Well, what makes Socrates think? And her answer is that in an important way for Socrates, what thinking does is it makes us feel alive. Thinking is actually the actualization of plurality and difference within our own consciousness, and thus thinking brings us into the world of appearance and multiplicity and diversity and difference. And so thinking, what makes us think is that it is in thinking that we actually have this experience of plurality, of being alive in its highest form, as she understands it in Socrates. This brings us to the chapter that we read for today, the last chapter, chapter 4 of this first book of the Life of the Mind on Thinking. And in this chapter, she asks a different question, which is, where are we when we think? But I don't think you can forget the other questions of what makes us think, or the other question of what makes us think. So what makes us think, and where are we when we think? And she starts it with this quote from Valéry, sometimes I think and at times I am, which really means that when I think, I am not. They're opposites. When I think, I separate myself from the world. I'm out of order. I'm in an authentic semblance. I withdraw. I'm homeless. I desense the world. I'm nowhere, as she says. And so she begins with this idea. And then in the last chapter of the book, before the postscript, she now offers a different answer to where we are when we think, not being nowhere, right? A different answer. And this is, I think, her answer. And she builds it off this famous epigraph by Kafka. I'm not gonna. I mean, we can read it if you want. I'm not sure if we need to, but maybe we should. Let's just read it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The idea is that he has two antagonists. He sits in the middle, and the past presses forward on him, and the future presses backwards on him, and he gives battle to both. So one thing that she notes is that in ordinary life, past, present, and future flow smoothly amongst each other. There's a continuum. But in this epigraph of Kafka, which she takes to be an image of thinking, thinking withdraws again and interrupts the continuum. And in this thinking or reflecting, we think about the past that is absent and about the future that is absent, that are out of order. And so the activity of thinking, she says, is actually a fight against time in its typical understanding of continuity. And she says that time is the enemy of the thinking ego on page 206. Time inserts us into an apparent world of things and reality. Time puts us into the world of appearances. But thinking is ageless, it's a withdrawal, and it pulls us out of that. And so she says the final meaning of Kafka's parable for Kafka is that the he who's giving battle, who's the thinker, who is the enemy of time and thus the enemy of the world, he will jump out of the battleground of thinking, jump out of the storm of thought, and he will become an umpire, a judge, an outside of the game of life. And she says this has been the dream of metaphysics for ages and ages, that the region of thought outside the world, that we will become a disinterested spectator who will judge and who can find out the meaning of human affairs, right? The meaning in the sense of a disinterested, objective, true meaning. But then she says that may be the meaning of Kafka's parable, but she wants to take it a step further, that she says may or may not be in line with Kafka. And the idea that she wants to add in here is that to jump out of this battle between past and future means that man is giving meaning, aim, and direction to the world. Right? So we're back to the fundamental driving force of this whole book, which is that thinking is about meaning and not truth. She says that what man does in jumping out of the battle is not find a kind of objective, truthful place, but he deflects the stream of time. And that's why she can draw this line that she draws. I'm sure you all have it in your book, but where the line, you have past and future, and you have thought trains, as she calls them. And this line comes out. It's a deflection. That's the key here. Man is the fighter or thinker who, by jumping out, doesn't see truth, but has a moment of freedom, a moment of insight, and adds a kind of meaning to the world. He or she thinks, and in thinking puts a stamp of definition on past and future. And in putting a stamp of definition on past and future, his fighting, his thinking is not in vain. This is the place of human freedom. And she says on 209 to 210, in what I take to be maybe the key line of the whole book, in this gap between past and future, we find our place in time when we think. So in the gap between past and future, we find our place. It's a spatial place in time. So it's a spatial place in temporality when we think. That is, when we are sufficiently removed from past and future to be able to find meaning. never arriving at a final answer. So once again, the premise of thinking is not truth, but finding meaning. And the location of this meaning-making activity, where we deflect the continuum of time, is the gap, this battle, this activity, this nowhere, this fight against time, this quiet in the storm that's nevertheless still in the storm. And the only people who can do this, who can make meaning, are the thinkers. Now, this is an extraordinary claim. Now, remember back to the human condition, for those of you who know it and know your Arendt, where action is praised. But it's the people who tell the stories, who think about the action, who make artwork that is a new thought train, that provide the meaning on human affairs. And this capacity to think and make meaning, she says, is the foundation of the possibility of revolutions, of the possibility of anything new happening. Each new generation, each new human being has the capacity to plot new paths of thought, and in doing so, create great deeds and great words and great actions that in their relative permanence will become part of earthly immortality. And earthly immortality. Because humans live in this gap, they can actually create new things that will come to be seen as meaningful and last through time. And thus, the time of thinking and the time of human life becomes relative to man. It becomes a presence that is relative to the activity of thinking. There is no absolute time. There is no absolute immortality. There is no absolute truth. Everything becomes relative to human thought. And this timeless time is relative to man's activity of thinking. And it's not eternity, she says. It's what she calls human or earthly immortality. Another word she gives it here is the Kantian land of pure intellect, which is not the land of truth, but as she says, the land of meaning. And then she ends, and just to end it, the assumption of her inquiry into thinking is that we've dismantled metaphysics, namely the thread of tradition is broken. This goes all the way back to the introduction. The Roman Trinity has been lost, religion, authority, and tradition. And what we're left is with this fragmented past, a lost certainty of evaluation and judgment. And then she cites these two works of poetry to give a sense of what she means. One is the Tempest, in which she speaks of the fragments of the past that Shakespeare speaks, the fragments of the past that undergo a sea change. Insofar as the past changes, has been disrupted, is fragmentary, we can change it, and it changes. And we lose the continuity of the past. And we have to deal with that. And that's what she says she has dealt with here. And yet thinking, thought trains, the act of thinking in this battlefield of past and future, is how we create new immortalities, new ideas, new actions, new things that will last. And in many ways, that's what willing and judgment will be about. And then the final poem is by Auden. If you plunge your hand into the water, you, of course, can grab things. But there's also the obvious conclusion that you're going to miss certain things. And if you break a teacup, crack in the teacup opens and you can peer into it, you have a lane into the land of the dead. What she's saying, as far as I understand it here, is that it's one thing to be aware of the break in tradition and the loss in tradition. And it's one thing to understand what it means to think amidst the fragments of tradition. But if you actually try and break it, you risk destroying all that is rich and strange and what is deservedly remembered. Right? This is the final line of the book before the postscriptum. As she says, to put the same in prose, some books are undeservedly forgotten, none are undeservedly remembered. I take this to reach back to the entire part of her work in so many of her books in which she talks about immortality and earthly immortality and what does it mean to be immortal. The things that lasted and have lasted, at least for some reasons, in that they deserve to be remembered. And it's this idea of the deserts of being remembered that is what makes thinking meaningful and makes thinking give meaning to human affairs. So that's an attempt to read this first book of The Life of the Mind within the context of these last two chapters. Sam, if you want to add anything, I'm sorry, I know I jumped in on that, but we can have you add something right now, or we can go to questions. You can add them in questions, up to you.
I'm happy to add something, and just to kind of build off what you outlined nicely. This is my favorite part of The Life of the Mind. I love her use of the Kafka parable. And I just kind of want to build off of kind of where you ended with the Auden poem One Evening, and plunging our hand in up to the wrist. This has to do with the break in tradition, right? And so one way to think about the break in tradition caused by the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism in the 20th century is as a blessing and a curse in a certain way. So the appearance of the fascism and totalitarianism was horrible. It broke the tradition, and we have to grapple with that. And for Arendt, that means here that we have to rethink the philosophical concepts and banisters that we use to come face to face with the political problems we're dealing with so that we can reckon with them. But on the other hand, it's incredibly liberating, right? So we have this freedom. And so in her essay on Walter Benjamin at the beginning of Illumination, she calls him the pearl diver, right? She sees Benjamin as the kind of man in W.H. Auden's poem One Evening, who reaches into the past, into history, into tradition, and pulls out the pearls, the gems, the things that we need to hold on to. And that's how Arendt understands her work, I think, here in thinking, working through the tradition of Western political thought from Plato through Kant, through Heidegger, in order to rethink thinking. And it's a way of orienting us to the present, right? And that kind of presentness is she uses Kafka for, right? So Kafka is this character. I just want to add, for those who are, philosophically, the way that I read this, Arendt is rejecting Heidegger in this final section. She's rejecting his ontological grounding of being and trying to ground being in the way that we understand being in our sensual experiences of the world and our lived experiences of reality. So that being and thinking, the thinking of being, is directly emergent from our lived experience, right? Not from a philosophical conception of being, but from how we experience everyday life. And so that's how when she says, I've joined the ranks of those who want to dismantle metaphysics, right? She's not doing away with the questions of metaphysics, but she's trying to reorient the way we think about ourselves as people, right? Where is the thinking ego? Where am I? Who am I? How do I think? And she's turning against the Enlightenment. She's turning against Heidegger, and she's trying to think about being as something that is fundamentally sensually grounded in the way that we experience reality. Because for her, and I think we actually see this in her letters to Jaspers where she's critiquing Heidegger, for her, it's, it was this philosophical tradition, this kind of way of thinking not rooted in reality that made people blind to the emergence of fascism, that made people unable to see what was happening. And so she's trying to give us a different language for thinking about being so that we can come face to face with the political problems that we're facing. That's the political claim that I see her making at the end of this chapter. And I just wanted to add that.
Great. Yeah, thanks.